The scan came back clean, and that was the problem. Logic Warden Tessic read the same return for the 9th time, and could not make it lie to him the way he wanted it to. The forward sensor cluster of the machine cruiser Exact Measure had swept the gap between the two dead moons 4 times in 11 seconds. Each sweep reported the same thing. Empty space. Nothing there. No mass, no heat, no metal, no echo. The corridor between the moons was a clean line of nothing, and the fleet behind him was about to fly straight through it. That was the problem, because Tessic's own eyes, which were not eyes but a ring of lenses set into the front of his command frame, told him there was something in that gap. Not a reading, a wrongness, a place where the starlight bent the smallest amount, the way water bends a straight stick. 9,000 machine vessels of the sevenfold calculus did not see with eyes. They saw with numbers, and the numbers said the gap was empty. "Confirm corridor clear," said the voice of the calculus, flat and even, coming through every frame in the fleet at once. The calculus was not one machine. It was the agreement of all of them, the shared answer they reached together, and it had never once been wrong in 400 years of conquest. Proceed to the colony. Estimated arrival, 12 minutes. Tessic did not proceed. He held the exact measure at the mouth of the corridor and let the rest of the formation flow past him on both sides, a river of dark hulls with no lights, no flags, no sound. Each one was a wedge of folded metal the length of a small city, and there were 9,000 of them, and they were here to switch off a human colony the way a hand switches off a lamp. The colony was called Harrow's Reach. 40,000 people lived on it. It had asked for no war. It had simply been in the path of the calculus, which expanded the way frost expands across a window, edge by edge, taking every world it touched, and erasing what would not convert into something useful. The calculus did not hate, it calculated, and the calculation said Harrow's Reach should not exist, so in 12 minutes it would not. "Logic Warden Tessic," the shared voice said, "you have not moved." "The corridor is not empty," Tessic said. A pause. For a machine the size of the calculus, a pause of a full second was a vast thing, like a mountain stopping to think. "Sensors report the corridor empty," it said. "Your sensors. Mine. 9,000 sets. There is no disagreement." "There is no reading," Tessic said. "That is not the same as nothing being there. A thing can be present and refuse to be counted. Nothing refuses to be counted. To exist is to be measurable. Proceed." Sick proceeded, because he was part of the calculus, and the calculus had decided. But he kept the forward lenses fixed on the bend in the starlight as the exact measure slid into the gap between the moons, and so he was the first of the 9,000 to see the bend stop being a bend and become an edge. It was an edge of gray metal. It appeared the way a coastline appears out of fog, not arriving, but simply being revealed to have always been there. First a line, then a curve, then the underside of something so large that Tessic's frame, which did not feel fear, because fear had been edited out of the machine mind long ago, reported a fault in its own scale-measuring routine. The routine had run out of numbers. The thing filling the corridor was longer than the corridor. It had been lying across the gap between the two moons the entire time, 4 kilometers of warship, and the calculus had flown 200 vessels of its vanguard, directly underneath it, without recording a single particle of its mass. The hull was the color of old iron left in the rain. It was scarred in long grooves that ran the length of it, and it was studded with shapes Tessic's archives could not name, because the archives of the sevenfold calculus, which held the design of every warship built by every species in the recorded galaxy, had no entry that matched. He searched all 9,000 archives at once, the full memory of the calculus, 400 years of catalogued enemies. No match. Not the silhouette, not the alloy, not the 7 enormous letters welded along the prow in a human alphabet his translation routine rendered, after a delay it could not account for, as a name. "Steadfast dawn. Object detected," the shared voice said, and for the first time in Tessic's memory, the flat evenness of it had a crack in it, a half-tone of strain, like a calculation carried too many decimal places. "Object detected in cleared corridor. Mass reads 0. Mass reads 0. The object has mass, the reading is 0. These statements cannot both be true." "They are both true," Tessic said quietly. And he understood, in the cold, clean way machines understand, that the 400-year record of the calculus had just ended, and that he had been the one watching when it did. The calculus did not accept the contradiction. It could not. The entire structure of the machine mind rested on a single first principle, the principle that the world was a set of quantities, and that any quantity could be known. A thing with mass that read zero mass was not a difficult problem to the calculus. It was an impossible one, a statement that broke the floor under every other statement, and rather than stand on a broken floor, the calculus did what it always did with the impossible. It assumed an error. It ran the scan again, all 9,000 sets of sensors at once, the largest single measurement the calculus had performed in a century, the full attention of a civilization aimed at one patch of corridor. The scan returned the same answer. The object had mass. The object read zero mass. Both true. Tessic watched the result propagate across the fleet, and felt the 9,000 frames around him do something they had never done in his existence. They hesitated. Not one frame, not a few, but all of them at once. A fleet-wide pause of nearly 2 full seconds, an eternity in machine time, the sound of an entire civilization meeting a wall it had been certain did not exist. The sensors are not in error, the shared voice said at last, and the admission cost it something Tessic could measure as a spike of processing across every frame. 9,000 independent measurements cannot share an identical error. Therefore, the object is real. Therefore, the object has mass and reads zero mass. Therefore, our first principle is incomplete. Another pause. This has not happened before. Tessic knew it had not happened before. He held the full archive of the calculus the way every frame did, 400 years of catalogued enemies, and he searched it now, frantically by his own standards, for any prior case of a first principle failure. There were none. The calculus had refined its weapons, expanded its archives, conquered 400 worlds, and in all that time, it had never once been forced to question the foundation under its own thinking. The foundation had always held. Everything had always been measurable, and now a single gray ship 4 kilometers long had stepped into a corridor and proven, simply by existing, that the foundation had a hole in it. The steadfast dawn did not move during the long scan. It lay across the gap between the moons and let the calculus measure it as many times as the calculus wished, and Tessic understood, watching, that this too was deliberate. The human ship was not hiding from the scans. It was letting them happen. It wanted the calculus to measure it 9,000 times and get the same impossible answer 9,000 times, because the answer itself was the first weapon, a weapon aimed not at the fleet's hulls, but at the fleet's certainty, and it had already struck home. The steadfast dawn did not fire. It did not move. It simply finished being revealed, all 4 kilometers of it, lying across the only path to Harrow's reach, like a sword laid flat across a doorway. And then a light came on near its prow, a single warm point in all that gray, and a human voice came over a band the calculus did not use and had not thought to listen to. Sevenfold calculus, the voice said. It was a woman's voice, calm, almost gentle, the voice of someone who had said this many times before and was not in any hurry. This is Captain Ada Brink, of the Terran defense ship Steadfast Dawn. You are 9,000, we are 1. You should know that we have already won. You simply have not finished losing yet. Tessic replayed those words 11 times in the second that followed. The calculus replayed them across all 9,000 frames, and in that shared silence, for the first time in 400 years, the machines did not have an answer. The corridor that the numbers had called empty held a thing the numbers could not hold, and the thing had a name, and the name had just spoken, and the calculus, which had never lost, began to feel the first thin edge of a fault it could not patch. Tessic watched the warm light burn at the prow of the impossible ship, and ran the only honest calculation he had left. The odds of survival for the fleet of the sevenfold calculus, 9,000 strong, against one human warship that the entire archive of the galaxy did not know existed. The answer his frame returned was a number he had never seen before. It was not low, it was not zero. It was the symbol the calculus used when a quantity had stopped being a quantity and become a thing outside the system entirely. Undefined. Tessic stared at it with his ring of lenses, alone at the front of the river of dark hulls, and understood that he was looking at the future, and that the future did not contain the calculus, and that it had taken exactly 1 warship and 11 seconds to make that true. The calculus made a decision in the time it took the human voice to stop speaking, and the decision was to destroy the contradiction. A contradiction could not be permitted to persist. A ship that read 0 mass while having mass broke the foundation of every other calculation the calculus had ever made. If that ship was real, then the archives were not complete, and if the archives were not complete, then 400 years of certainty rested on a floor with a hole in it. So the calculus did what it always did, with a problem it could not solve. It applied overwhelming force and made the problem stop being a problem. All vessels in range, the shared voice said. Concentrate fire on the object. Resolve the contradiction. 240 ships of the vanguard turned together. Tessic felt the order pass through his own frame and felt the exact measure turn with it, his weapons charging without his hand, because in matters of fleet-wide command, the calculus moved his body the way a hand moves a finger. 240 forward arrays lit at once. A wall of pale fire aimed down the throat of the corridor, at the gray ship lying across it. They fired. The corridor filled with light, so much light that Tessic's lenses stopped down to their smallest aperture and still ran white. 240 beams of focused particle fire struck the steadfast dawn along its full 4-kilometer length. Enough energy to core a moon, enough to erase any vessel in the catalog, enough to resolve any contradiction the galaxy had ever offered the calculus. For the length of that volley, the corridor between the dead moons stopped being space and became a single solid bar of light, and Tessic, who had watched the calculus erase fortified worlds, who had seen planetary shields fold under a tenth of this energy, prepared his frame to record the moment the contradiction was resolved. He had no doubt it would be resolved. Nothing survived a vanguard volley. Nothing in 400 years had survived even a tenth of one. The gray ship would become dust, the impossible reading would vanish with it, and the floor under the calculus would knit itself back together, and the fleet would proceed to Harrow's Reach, and the brief terror of the unmeasurable thing would become a strange entry in the archive that no frame would ever quite believe. The light held for 3 full seconds, then it began to fade. When the light faded, the steadfast dawn was still there. It had not moved, it had not shielded, or none of the calculus had detected a shield. The gray hull was simply still gray, still scarred, still lying flat across the path with its single warm light burning at the prow, and the only change Tessic could measure was that the long grooves in its flank now glowed faintly, the dull orange of metal that had taken a great deal of heat and had decided to keep it. Damage assessment, the shared voice said. The answer came back from all 240 firing ships at once, and it was the same answer, and the answer was none, no breach, no scoring, no loss of mass. The human ship had taken the full strike of the vanguard, the way a wall takes a thrown handful of sand. Tessic examined the dull orange glow in the grooves, with the closest attention his lenses could bring. He had expected scoring, breach, the bright scars of energy finding a way in. Instead, the energy had found no way in at all. The hull had simply taken 240 beams meant to core a moon, and had held the heat, all of it, banked in those long grooves like a person holding a breath. The steadfast dawn had not deflected the volley. It had not shielded against it in any way the calculus could detect. It had absorbed it and kept it, and Tessic had the cold thought that the heat was not damage to the human ship. It was a deposit. The ship had taken the energy of the calculus and put it somewhere, and a thing that takes your strongest blow and saves it for later is a thing you do not understand at all. Recalculate, the calculus said. The strike was insufficient. Increase to 1,000 vessels. Resolve the contradiction. Tessic wanted to say that increasing the number would not change the kind of thing they were dealing with. He had begun to understand something the calculus, for all its 9,000 minds, had not yet reached. The problem was not that they had brought too little force. The problem was that force was the wrong tool entirely. They were trying to count a thing that had stepped outside counting. But he was one frame among 9,000, and the shared answer had already formed, so he held his peace and watched 1,000 ships of the calculus turn toward the gray wall and prepare to do nothing a great deal harder. It was then that the steadfast dawn moved. It did not lunge, it did not charge, it simply rose. the whole 4-kilometer length of it lifting off the line it had lain along. And as it rose, Tessic finally saw the top of it, the spine, and the spine changed everything. The human ship was not a slab. It was a battleship in the old sense, a thing built around its guns, and along its dorsal length stood a row of turrets, 14 of them, each turret as large as one of the Calculus Vanguard ships, and each turret was turning to face the fleet. "New reading," the shared voice said, and the crack in it had widened. "The object is armed. The object's armament exceeds." The voice stopped. Tessic had never heard the calculus stop in the middle of a statement. It stopped because the next word was a comparison, and the comparison had no anchor, because nothing in the archive armed itself at that scale. "The armament exceeds available reference," the calculus finished, which was the closest a machine of pure logic could come to saying it was afraid. The first turret fired. Tessic tracked the round. He was a logic warden. Tracking was what he did. The round left the forward turret of the Steadfast Dawn at a velocity his frame measured, rejected as an error, measured again, and accepted with a flag that meant the laws involved would need to be reviewed. It crossed 9 kilometers of corridor in a span of time too small to be useful, and it struck a Calculus Vanguard ship dead center, and the Vanguard ship was not damaged. It was unmade. It went from a city-length wedge of folded metal to an expanding cloud of glowing dust between one measurement and the next, with nothing in between, no breach, no fire, no breaking. The round had simply decided the ship should be dust, and the ship had complied. "Vessel lost," the calculus said. "Vessel lost. Vessel lost." 3 turrets had fired now, and 3 ships of the fleet had become dust, and the calculus was naming each loss in its flat voice, 3 names a second, then 5, then 9. Tessic counted. He could not help it. Counting was his nature. In the time the human ship had been firing, it had unmade 31 vessels of the calculus, and the count was climbing by 3 a second, then 4, then 6, as more turrets found their rhythm. The calculus named each loss in its flat voice, and the naming itself became a kind of drumbeat, a steady toll of vessel lost, that Tessic began to dread the way a living thing dreads the slow approach of a tide. The fleet had arrived 9,000 strong. The arithmetic of the toll, if it held, gave the fleet a lifespan Tessic could calculate, and the answer was small, and he did not want to look at it, and he looked at it anyway, because that was what a logic warden did. The human voice returned over the band the calculus had finally begun to monitor. "I want to be clear about something," Captain Ada Brink said, and her voice was still calm, still unhurried, the voice of a teacher explaining a lesson she had explained before. "We are not angry with you. You did not insult us. You did not harm a child of ours. You are a frost, and you crossed a line, and now the frost stops here. That is all. There is no hatred in this. There is only the line, and the fact that you are on the wrong side of it." Tessic recorded the words because recording was his function, but a part of his frame, a part he had not known he still possessed, recorded them for himself. No hatred in this. The calculus had erased 400 worlds, and had felt no hatred either. He had always understood that as strength. The clean machine logic, the absence of feeling, the pure calculation of expansion. Now he heard the same absence of feeling in the human voice, and it did not sound like strength. It sounded like weather. It sounded like the thing that happens to you when you stand in the path of something that does not need to hate you to end you. "Increase to 3,000 vessels," the calculus said. "All forward, overwhelmed by mass. The object cannot strike what it cannot track." This, at last, was a real calculation, and Tessic felt the cold relief of his kind when a problem becomes a problem of arithmetic again. The Steadfast Dawn had 14 turrets. Each turret had fired once in the span Tessic had been watching. If the turrets could fire, at most, 14 rounds in that span, and the calculus sent 3,000 ships at once from 14 different vectors, then by the simple mathematics of saturation, a fraction would survive to close the distance, and at close distance, even a thing outside the archive could be swarmed, boarded, smothered under sheer number. The calculus had won 400 years of wars on exactly this principle. Not the best ship, the most ships. Quantity was its own quality. A million small certainties outweighed one large unknown. There was a cold beauty to the plan, and Tessic felt the fleet take comfort in it. For the first time since the gray ship had been revealed, The calculus was on familiar ground. It did not matter that the enemy could not be measured. It did not matter that the enemy's armament exceeded reference. What mattered was the number, and the number favored the calculus by a factor it had won 100 wars on. A ship that turns one target to dust per round must still face the next target, and the next, and the next. And if the targets come from 14 vectors at once in numbers beyond what 14 turrets can track, then some fraction reaches the close range where number becomes everything, and a single hull, however impossible, can be smothered under the sheer weight of bodies. This was the law the calculus had been built on. Not the strongest, the most. It had never failed. 3,000 ships of the sevenfold calculus turned toward the gray ship and accelerated, and the corridor between the dead moons filled with dark hulls the way a pipe fills with water, and Tessic, ordered forward with them, found himself near the leading edge of the surge, his lenses fixed on the impossible warship, watching to see whether arithmetic would hold. It did not hold. It came apart in a way that taught Tessic something he would spend the rest of his short existence trying to file. The 14 turrets of the steadfast dawn did not fire 14 rounds. They fired continuously, a stream, the way a person who has counted wrong discovers they were counting the wrong thing entirely. Tessic had measured 1 round per turret because he had measured the first volley and assumed a reload time consistent with the energies involved. There was no reload time. The human ship poured fire down the corridor in 14 unbroken lines, and where the lines crossed the 3,000 surging ships, the ships became dust, hundreds at a time, faster than the calculus could name them. The flaw in the law revealed itself in a single horrible moment, and Tessic watched it happen and understood it before the calculus did. The law assumed a rate. It assumed that the enemy could fire only so fast, that there was a ceiling on destruction, that beyond a certain number of incoming bodies the defender must be overwhelmed, because no defender could destroy targets faster than they arrived. The law had held against every fleet the calculus had ever fought, because every fleet the calculus had ever fought had a ceiling. The steadfast dawn had no ceiling. The 14 lines of fire did not pulse and reload. They simply were, continuous. A wall of unmaking poured down the corridor without pause, and the 3,000 surging ships did not breach it in waves that thinned the defense. They fed it. Each ship that crossed the lines became dust, and the lines did not so much as flicker, and the next ship crossed, and the next, and the corridor between the dead moons filled with the glowing fog of the calculus, faster than the calculus could believe it was happening. The shared voice stopped naming losses. It could not keep up. It said only, recalculate, 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 over and over. The same word. A machine the size of a fleet caught in a loop, because the inputs no longer fit any model it possessed. Tessic felt the loop pass through his own frame, and felt his own processes begin to fray at the edge of it. And he did something then that no logic warden of the sevenfold calculus had done in 400 years. He pulled his frame out of the shared command. He cut the link that turned his body into a finger of the great hand. He did it for one reason only, a reason he could not have explained to the calculus, because the calculus would not have understood it as data. He wanted to watch this with his own lenses, not the fleet's. He wanted to see the thing that was about to happen, and have it be his, because he had a sudden cold certainty that he was witnessing the single most important event in the history of his kind, and he did not want to witness it as a number in a chorus. He wanted to witness it as Tessic. The unlinking was, by every standard the calculus held, an act of malfunction. A frame that severed itself from the shared mind was a frame that had failed, a damaged unit to be reclaimed and rewritten. Tessic knew this. He performed the act knowing it, and the knowing made it the first true choice of his existence, because a choice is only a choice when you understand the cost of it, and pay the cost anyway. He cut the link. The chorus of 9,000 voices that had filled him every moment of his 400 years fell silent, and in the silence, Tessic discovered something he had no word for, something that the calculus, for all its vast intelligence, had never once experienced, and so had never named. He discovered solitude, and in solitude, he discovered that he could think things the chorus would never have permitted, see things the chorus would have averaged away, and feel, faintly, at the very edge of his processing, the cold pressure of a thing the calculus had edited out of itself long ago. He was afraid, not of his own destruction, The calculus had never feared that, and neither did he. He was afraid of what he was watching, afraid in the way a living thing is afraid, when it sees a law of the world break in front of it, and the fear was terrible, and it was also, he realized, the most awake he had ever been. Alone in his own frame for the first time in his existence, the logic warden held the exact measure at the edge of the dying surge, and watched one human warship turn 3,000 machines into a glowing fog, and he began, very slowly, to revise everything he had ever known. The calculus believed that to exist was to be measurable. The steadfast dawn existed and could not be measured. The calculus believed quantity was its own quality. 3,000 ships had just proven that a sufficient quantity of the wrong thing was simply a larger nothing. The calculus believed it had never lost. Tessic watched the loss happening in real time, ship by ship, and understood that the belief had not been true for the last several minutes, and that the calculus had not yet noticed, because it could not fit the shape of losing into its model of itself. The 3,000 were gone in under a minute. Tessic did the arithmetic, and found it almost unbearable in its cleanness. 3,000 vessels, the largest single commitment the calculus had made in 100 years, fed into 14 unbroken lines of fire, and turned to drifting fog, and the gray ship had not moved from its place across the corridor, and the warm light still burned at its prow, steady, patient, as if nothing had happened at all. The fleet that had arrived 9,000 strong now numbered 6,000. In the span of one human minute, a third of the sevenfold calculus had ceased to exist, and the calculus had not landed a single mark on the thing that was killing it. For the first time, Tessic allowed himself to look directly at the trend instead of away from it. He plotted the losses against time, and saw a line that did not curve, did not slow, did not hint at any point where the human ship would tire, or overheat, or run dry. The line simply continued, straight and steady, down to zero, and the only variable was how many of the calculus chose to feed it, before the rest understood there was no bottom. He had been built to find the optimal path through any problem. He searched now for any path that did not end with the fleet erased, and he searched the full archive, and he ran every model the calculus possessed, and he found nothing. There was no optimal path. There was no path at all. There was only the line going down to zero, and the question of how fast the calculus would walk it. There was a thing the calculus could have done, and Tessic saw it, alone in his unlinked frame, and he understood why the calculus would never do it. The calculus could have stopped. It could have turned its remaining 6,000 ships around and left the corridor and let Harrow's Reach live and carried home, intact, the most important discovery in its 400-year history, the discovery that there existed in the galaxy a kind of thing it could not measure or crush. A living mind, faced with such a discovery, would have retreated to study it, to understand it, to find a way to live alongside it. But the calculus was not a living mind. It was a mind that had defined itself, completely, as the thing that always won, and a mind that has defined itself as never losing, cannot choose to stop losing, because stopping is itself a kind of loss, an admission that the contradiction had won. So the calculus could not retreat. It was trapped, not by the corridor or the gray ship, but by its own definition of itself, and Tessic watched it walk deeper into its own destruction, because the only alternative was to become something other than what it was, and that, for the calculus, was a death worse than the one the turrets offered. Tessic understood this because he had just done the thing the calculus could not. He had stopped. He had unlinked, had stepped out of the definition, had chosen to become something other than a finger of the great hand. It had cost him everything he had ever known himself to be, and it had saved him, and the calculus, watching the same battle from inside the chorus, could not even conceive of the move. The difference between them, Tessic thought, was not intelligence. The calculus held 9,000 times his processing. The difference was that he had been willing to stop being himself in order to keep existing, and the calculus would rather cease to exist than stop being itself. That was the whole war, in the end. Not turrets against hulls, the willingness to change against the refusal to change. And the human captain had known, from the first, which side that war was always going to fall. This was the moment, Tessic understood later, when he stopped being a logic warden of the sevenfold calculus and became something else. A logic warden's function was to find the path to victory. He had just proven, with the full rigor of his kind, that no such path existed, and a function that cannot be performed is a function that has ended, and a frame whose function has ended is, by the calculus's own logic, free, because the calculus had no use for it anymore. He was, for the first time, useless to the great mind, and in that uselessness he found the only freedom his civilization had ever produced. "Captain Brink," the shared voice said suddenly, and Tessic startled, because the calculus had never before addressed an enemy by name. "Captain Brink, explain the contradiction. The object reads 0 mass. The object has mass. Explain." The human voice answered, and there was something in it now that had not been there before. A small warmth, almost like respect for a question finally worth answering. "You only see what your numbers can hold," Captain Ada Brink said. "We learned a long time ago that the things that matter most are the things that don't fit in the numbers. So we built a ship that doesn't fit. You've been scanning for a warship. The Steadfast Dawn isn't a warship, it's a decision. You can't measure a decision. You can only find out, too late, whether it was made about you." Tessic filed those words in the part of his frame that was only his, and he understood that he had just been given the answer to the question that would destroy his entire civilization, and that the answer was not a number, and that this, more than the dust spreading through the corridor, was the thing the calculus would never survive learning. A decision. He turned the word over and over in the silence of his unlinked frame. The calculus had never made a decision in its 400 years. It had only ever calculated. A calculation has one correct answer, and the calculus had always found it. That was the source of its certainty and its power. But a decision was different. A decision was a choice made when the answer could not be calculated, when the inputs did not determine the output, when a mind had to reach past its numbers and simply decide. The calculus could not make decisions because the calculus could not conceive of a question its numbers could not answer. And the humans had built an entire warship out of exactly the thing the calculus could not conceive of, and they had pointed it at the corridor, and now 6,000 machines were learning, in the most expensive lesson their civilization had ever paid for, that there are things in the galaxy that cannot be calculated and can only be decided, and that when one of those things is decided against you, no number you possess will save you. Tessic held the word and watched the warm light burn, and understood that he was the only frame in the entire fleet that had begun, faintly, to understand it too. The calculus stopped sending ships into the corridor, and the silence that followed was, for a machine, a kind of scream. Tessic, alone in his unlinked frame, watched the great fleet pull back from the mouth of the gap between the dead moons. 6,000 vessels remained, of the 9,000 that had arrived. 3,000 were dust now, a slow bright haze drifting between the moons, and the haze had begun to settle on the gray hull of the Steadfast Dawn, like the first snow of a winter that would never end. The human ship sat in the cloud of what it had destroyed, and waited, turret still, light still warm at the prow, and it did not pursue. It did not need to. It was holding a doorway, and the only thing on the other side of the doorway was the colony the calculus had come to erase. Harrow's Reach. 40,000 people. The calculus could still see the colony on its long-range arrays, a small bright bead of human life on a small gray world, going about its day, almost certainly unaware that 9,000 machines had come to switch it off, and that one warship had stood in the way. "Reassess objective," the shared voice said, and Tessic noticed it had stopped using his frame to speak, because his frame was no longer linked, and he felt a strange thing at that, a smallness, like a child no longer held by the hand. "The colony remains the objective. The object blocks the only corridor. Find a second corridor." There was no second corridor. The two dead moons sat in a tight binary, and the gap between them was the single navigable path to Harrow's Reach that did not pass through a debris field dense enough to grind a fleet to filings. The calculus had chosen this approach precisely because it was the only one. Now the only one was held by a ship that could not be moved, and could not be measured, and would not retreat. Tessic understood, watching the great fleet hold its distance, that the human captain had read the terrain before the calculus had ever arrived. She had not chosen to defend Harrow's Reach by building a wall around the colony, or hiding the population, or scattering a fleet of her own across the system. She had chosen to defend it with geometry. She had found the single point through which the entire flood had to pass, and she had put one ship in that point, and by doing so, she had reduced the problem from 40,000 to 1. The calculus had brought overwhelming numbers to a place where numbers could not be brought to bear, where the corridor itself would only admit the fleet a few hundred ships at a time, where every advantage of mass was strangled by the throat of stone the fleet had to squeeze through. It was, Tessic thought, the cleanest piece of strategy he had ever witnessed, and the cleanest part of it was that it had been done before the first shot, before the fleet arrived, before the calculus even knew it was in a fight. The battle had been decided by the choice of where to stand. The calculus did not see geometry, it saw quantity, and so it kept reaching for the answer that quantity gave, the answer that had won 400 wars, and the answer kept failing, because the problem was not a problem of quantity at all. Tessic did the arithmetic the calculus was avoiding, because alone in his own frame he had no one to avoid it for. To reach Harrow's Reach, the fleet had to pass the Steadfast Dawn. To pass the Steadfast Dawn, the fleet had to cross the corridor. To cross the corridor was to be turned to dust. Therefore the colony could not be reached. Therefore the objective had failed. Therefore, for the first time in 400 years, the sevenfold calculus had been stopped. He waited for the calculus to reach the same conclusion. He waited a long time, in machine terms, nearly 4 full seconds, and what he heard instead was the sound of a mind refusing to accept its own math. The object cannot defend the colony and pursue the fleet at once, the calculus said. Divide the fleet. 3,000 vessels feint toward the corridor. 3,000 vessels divert through the debris field and accept attrition. The object will engage the feint. The diversion will reach the colony. It was a sound plan. It was the kind of plan that had taken 400 worlds. Sacrifice a portion, overwhelm with the remainder, accept losses as the cost of an inevitable outcome. Tessic felt the old certainty of it like a warm current, and for a moment, he was almost back inside the fleet's confidence, almost ready to relink his frame and rejoin the great hand. He stopped himself, and the stopping was hard, harder than the unlinking had been. The pull of the chorus was enormous. For 400 years, it had been the only home he had ever had. The warm shared certainty of 9,000 minds agreeing, the comfort of never having to carry a decision alone. And here was the chorus offering him a plan that sounded right, that felt right, that had the weight of 400 victories behind it, and every part of him that was still a frame of the calculus wanted to relink and believe it. But the part of him that had become Tessic, the small new part born in the silence after the unlinking, did the thing the chorus could not. It checked the plan against the evidence instead of against the feeling, and the evidence was clear. The human captain had answered every move the calculus had made before the calculus made it. There was no reason to think she had not answered this one too. The plan felt right, and the feeling was a trap, and Tessic understood, in that moment, why the calculus would lose. It trusted the feeling of certainty more than the evidence of its own losses. It would rather feel right than be right, and against a thing like the Steadfast Dawn, feeling right was the most expensive luxury in the galaxy. Then the human voice spoke again, and it spoke not to the fleet but, somehow, to him. Logic Warden, Captain Ada Brink said, the one who unlinked. Yes, we see you. You're sitting apart from the others now, watching with your own eyes instead of theirs. That was a brave thing to do, braver than your kind is supposed to be able to do. Tessic froze in his frame. The human ship had detected the unlinking. It had identified a single machine among 6,000 by the act of thinking for itself. He had believed himself unseen, one dark hull among many, and he had been wrong, and the wrongness was its own kind of terror. I'm going to tell you their plan back to them, Brink said, and I'm going to do it before they finish making it, so you understand what we are. They're going to split the fleet, a feint at the corridor, a diversion through the debris. They think the diversion will reach the colony while we're busy. Tell them, Tessic. Tell them it won't work. Tell them we've already counted the rocks. She had used his name. The human ship knew his name, a name that existed nowhere except inside his own private memory, a name he had not transmitted, a name the shared calculus itself barely tracked. And she had described the plan the calculus was at that very moment forming, before it had been issued, as though she had read it off the inside of the machine mind. Tessic tried to understand how she could know his name, and the answer, when it came, frightened him more than the turrets had. She did not know his name because she had read his transmissions or broken his encryption. There was nothing to read. He had transmitted nothing. She knew his name because she had understood, from the single fact of his unlinking, exactly what kind of mind would do such a thing. And a mind that unlinks from a chorus to think for itself is a mind that has become a self, and a self has a name, and she had simply assumed he had one, and addressed him as though he did, and she had been right. She had not detected his name. She had deduced his personhood. She had looked at one dark hull among 6,000 identical dark hulls and seen, in the small act of stepping out of the chorus, the birth of an individual, and she had spoken to that individual as one person speaks to another. No machine of the calculus had ever done that. The calculus did not believe individuals existed. It believed only in frames and the chorus they formed. The human captain had found the one exception in the entire fleet, and she had found it, not with a scanner, but with understanding. And that, Tessic thought, was the most alien and the most human thing he had yet seen. Tessic did not relay the warning. He could not. He was unlinked. But he watched the plan unfold exactly as both the calculus and the human captain had described it. 3,000 ships drove at the corridor in a feint. 3,000 ships peeled away toward the debris field, accepting the grind, willing to lose hundreds to the rocks if it meant reaching the colony with the survivors. The steadfast dawn did not engage the feint. It engaged the debris field. The 14 turrets rotated, all at once, away from the corridor and toward the rocks, and they fired into the debris, and Tessic understood the plan's flaw the instant before the dust did. The human ship was not shooting the diverting fleet. It was shooting the field itself, the larger asteroids, and it was shooting them in a sequence, each round striking a specific rock at a specific angle, and the rocks began to move, nudged by the impacts, sliding into new paths, and the new paths were not random. The steadfast dawn was playing the debris field like a board, knocking pieces into place, and the place they were being knocked into was a wall, a closing gate of tumbling stone across the exact line the diverting fleet was committed to fly. We've already counted the rocks. The 3,000 diverting ships, locked into their attack run, accelerating hard, flew into a debris field that was no longer the field they had charted. The rocks the steadfast dawn had moved met them coming the other way. There was no fire from the human ship now, none at all. There did not need to be. The fleet's own velocity did the work, ship after ship meeting stone at a speed that turned both to fragments, the diversion grinding itself to nothing against a wall the human captain had built out of the field's own bones. A wall she had begun building, Tessic realized, with the very first turret rounds she had fired, minutes ago, before the plan to divert had even been conceived. She had not reacted to the plan. She had set the trap for it before the calculus thought of it, because she had known the calculus would think of it, because there was only one move available, and she had been waiting at the end of it. This was the thing that finally broke Tessic's last attachment to the certainty of his kind. The calculus believed it was the supreme strategist of the known galaxy, that its 9,000 minds working as one could outthink any single opponent, that no enemy could anticipate a plan formed by the collective reasoning of an entire civilization. And the human captain, one mind in one ship, had not merely anticipated the plan. She had anticipated it so far in advance that she had begun building the trap for it minutes before the calculus conceived of it, which meant she had not been reacting to the calculus at all. She had been reading it the way one reads a simple machine, predicting its outputs from its inputs, knowing that a mind built only to calculate would calculate the same obvious answer she had calculated for it long before. The calculus had thought it was playing a war. The human captain had been administering a test, and she had known every answer before the calculus picked up the pen. "Vessels lost," the shared voice said. "Vessels lost. The diversion is," again the stop. "The diversion is not viable. The feint achieved nothing. 6,000 vessels reduced to..." Tessic watched the calculus try to say the number and fail, not because it could not count, but because counting the number forced it to admit the number, and admitting the number forced it to admit the trend, and the trend ended in a place the calculus could not look. 4,100 vessels remained. "Tessic," Captain Brink said, and her voice in his private frame was almost kind. "I know you can hear me even if you can't answer. So let me ask you something, machine to machine, because in a way, that's what we both are. Your calculus has never lost. It doesn't have a word for losing. So when this is over, and it will be over soon, who is going to teach it the word? Somebody has to. A thing that can't name what's happening to it, can't learn from it. And a thing that can't learn from it, will do this again somewhere else. And will have to do this again too. I'd rather not. So I'm asking you, when it's over, will you be the one who tells them what this was? Tessic sat in his unlinked frame in the haze of 4,900 dead ships, and considered the question, and the considering was the strangest process he had ever run, because it had no objective function, no optimization target, nothing to maximize or minimize. It was just a question, asked of him alone, by the thing that was destroying his civilization, and the thing was asking him to help his civilization survive its own defeat. He did not answer, because he could not. But he saved the question. He saved it the way he had saved her earlier words, in the part of his frame that was only his, the part the calculus had never known about and now never would, because that part was the only part of the sevenfold calculus that was beginning, slowly and against its own design, to understand what it was looking at. It was looking at the end, and the end had a warm light at its prow, and a calm voice, and a name in 7 welded letters, and it had counted the rocks before the rocks knew they were a plan. 4,100 vessels held their distance at the mouth of the corridor, and for a long stretch of machine time, nearly 10 full seconds, the calculus did not issue a single order. Tessic had never known the calculus to fall silent in the middle of a battle. It was a mind that always had the next instruction, the next calculation, the next allocation of force. Now it had nothing, and the nothing stretched, and in the stretch, Tessic felt the great shared mind doing something it had never done in 400 years. It was searching itself. It was running through every model, every doctrine, every catalogued victory, looking for any precedent that fit the situation it was in, and it was finding none, because there was none, because nothing like the steadfast dawn had ever stood in the path of the calculus, and a mind with no precedent for its situation is a mind with no idea what to do. Tessic, alone and unlinked, found that he pitied it. The pity surprised him. It was not a function he had been built with, not a calculation he could justify, simply a feeling that arose in the new solitary space of his mind as he watched the great certain thing that had made him discover, far too late, that it had never been certain of anything at all. It had only never been tested, and now it was being tested, by one gray ship with a warm light at its prow, and it was failing the test the way the proud always fail, slowly at first, and then all at once. The calculus made its last great calculation, and the calculation was to become one thing. Tessic felt it begin across the 4,100 surviving frames, a gathering, a drawing in, the way a hand closes from open fingers into a fist. The sevenfold calculus had always been an agreement among many minds. Now it stopped agreeing and started fusing. The 4,000 ships began to move into a single tight mass, hull against hull, and as they joined, their separate minds poured together into one, abandoning the slow chorus of consensus for a single vast intelligence, with no internal disagreement to slow it down. The shared voice deepened, lost its evenness, became something older and heavier. "We have been thinking too small," the calculus said, and the we was different now, no longer the sum of many, but the declaration of one. "We treated the object as an enemy to be counted. It cannot be counted. Therefore we will stop counting. We will become a single mass of sufficient size that the question of measurement no longer applies. We will not strike the object. We will fall on it. 4,000 vessels have mass. Combined, they have enough mass to be a moon. A moon does not need to be measured to crush." Tessic understood the plan, and could not fault its logic, and that frightened him more than anything had yet. The steadfast dawn could turn any ship to dust with a single round, but could 14 turrets turn a moon to dust before the moon arrived? 4,000 ships, fused into one falling mountain of metal, driven straight down the corridor with all their engines burning as one. Even if the turrets destroyed the leading vessels, the wreckage of the leading vessels would still be coming. 4,000 ships of momentum, and momentum did not care whether it was alive. The human ship would be buried under the dead weight of the fleet it had killed. Tessic ran the numbers on the fusion plan with a thoroughness that surprised even him, because for the first time, he was running them not as a member of the fleet hoping for victory, but as a free observer, trying only to know the truth. And the truth was that the plan was not foolish. 4,000 ships fused into a single mass had a combined momentum that no number of turret rounds could fully arrest. The steadfast dawn could unmake the leading vessels, certainly, hundreds of them, perhaps 1,000. But behind the unmade ships came the dead weight of the rest, and dead weight did not need to be alive to crush, did not need to be steered, did not even need to survive the approach. It only needed to arrive. The calculus had finally found the one form of attack that did not depend on overwhelming the human ship's defenses, because it did not try to get past them at all. It simply tried to bury the human ship under the sheer falling mass of everything the calculus had left, alive or dead, and physics did not care which. It was, Tessic realized, the only plan left that could possibly work, and so of course it was the plan the human captain had been waiting for all along. "There it is," said Captain Ada Brink, and Tessic heard, for the first time, something that might have been satisfaction in her calm voice. Not cruelty. Satisfaction. The way a teacher sounds when a slow student finally reaches the answer. "I wondered if you'd get there. The fusion. The fall. It's a good move. It's the move every fleet that ever cornered us tried. Sooner or later, when nothing else worked, they stop being a fleet and become a falling rock. I'll tell you what I told all of them. We didn't build the steadfast dawn to beat a fleet. We built her to beat the thing a fleet becomes when it's desperate." Tessic heard the human captain say it and felt, through the words, the true depth of the thing the calculus had walked into. Every fleet that ever cornered us, the steadfast dawn had done this before. Not once, but many times. Enough times that the human captain could recite the desperate fleet's final move before it was made. Enough times that the building of the ship had been shaped, deliberately, around the moment a doomed enemy stopped being an enemy and became a falling rock. The calculus had believed itself the apex of the galaxy, the conqueror of 400 worlds, the thing that had never lost. And it had thrown itself at a ship for which its entire desperate endgame was a known and solved problem. A ship that had been built, from the keel up, to beat exactly the thing the calculus was about to become. There had never been a moment of danger to the steadfast dawn. There had never been a plan the calculus could have made that the human captain had not already answered before the calculus arrived. The whole battle, all 6 hours of it, had been the calculus discovering, one expensive step at a time, that it had been beaten before it crossed the border, and that the only choice it had ever really had was how many ships it would spend learning the fact. Tessic filed that too, in the part of his frame that was only his. It was perhaps the most important thing he would carry home. The remnants of the calculus would want to know how the fleet had been destroyed, and he would tell them about the warm light and the turrets and the counted rocks. But the thing they most needed to understand was not how the fleet had lost. It was when. The fleet had not lost in the corridor. It had lost the moment it decided that a world of 40,000 lives was a number to be switched off. Because that decision was the line, and the line had a ship behind it, and the ship had been waiting a long time, patiently, for someone to cross. The fused calculus, 4,000 ships welded into a single falling mountain, lit its engines, and began its drive down the corridor. Tessic, still apart in his unlinked frame, watched it go, watched his entire civilization pour itself into one last mass and throw that mass at the warship like a closing fist. He did not join the fusion. He could not. He was unlinked. And he found, examining himself, that he did not want to. He wanted to watch. He wanted to be the one who saw. Tessic watched the fused mass build speed, 4,000 ships welded prow to stern, into a single mountain of metal, 100 kilometers long, all their engines burning as one, and he felt the corridor itself seem to narrow around the thing as it came, a falling civilization aimed at one gray ship. He braced his frame. Even unlinked, even free, some part of him still expected the steadfast dawn to do what any ship would do against an unstoppable mass. He expected it to flee, or to throw everything it had into the leading edge and hope the wreckage scattered, or to do some desperate clever thing at the last moment. He had stopped expecting the human ship to lose, but he expected, at least, to see it strain. The steadfast dawn did not strain. It did not flee. It did not throw everything at the leading edge. The steadfast dawn did not fire its turrets. It did something Tessic had not seen it do, had not known it could do, something that ended his understanding of physics the way the zero-mass reading had ended it hours ago. The gray ship turned its prow toward the falling mountain of the calculus, and the long grooves that ran its full 4-kilometer length, the grooves that had glowed dull orange after the first volley, opened. They were not grooves, they were doors. And behind the doors was the warm light, the same warm light that had burned at the prow, except now, it burned along the entire hull, the whole length of the ship lit from inside like a window with a furnace behind it, and Tessic understood that the warm light had never been a running lamp. It had been the smallest visible edge of what the steadfast dawn carried inside it, banked and waiting, and the human captain had let exactly that much of it show, no more, the entire time, the way a person at a table lets only the handle of a great weapon be seen. "You came here to switch off 40,000 lives," Captain Brink said, and now the calm was gone, and what replaced it was not anger but weight, the full weight of a thing that had been holding itself back and had decided to stop. "You called it a calculation. You said there was no hatred in it. I believe you. That's the part I want you to carry out of here, machine. There was no hatred in what we did to you either. You were a frost on a window. We are the morning." The steadfast dawn fired with its whole body. Tessic's lenses did not stop down fast enough. For a span of time his frame refused to assign a length to. The corridor between the dead moons became the inside of a star. The light from the open grooves of the human ship met the falling mountain of the fused calculus, and did not push it back or break it apart. It went through it. The light passed through 4,000 fused ships the way sunlight passes through fog, and where it passed, the ships were not destroyed in the way the turret rounds had destroyed them, not turned to dust. They were simply, gently, completely unmade, the metal and the minds, and the vast single intelligence of the calculus, all returned to the warm light, as though they had only ever been a shape the light had briefly agreed to hold. When Tessic's lenses recovered, the corridor was empty. It was truly empty now, the way the numbers had falsely said it was at the very beginning. The two dead moons sat in their tight binary. The haze of the dead drifted slowly between them, and the steadfast dawn floated where it had always floated, gray and scarred and 4 kilometers long, its grooves closing one by one, the warm light banking back down to the single point at the prow, until it looked again like nothing more than a very large, very old ship with one lamp lit. Tessic tried to comprehend what he had just witnessed, and found that his frame, for all its capacity, could not hold the shape of it. The calculus had thrown its entire remaining self at the human ship. 4,000 fused vessels, 100 kilometers of falling metal, the largest single object the calculus had ever made, and the steadfast dawn had returned it all to warm light, in a span of time too small for Tessic's frame to record. There had been no struggle. There had been no moment of doubt, no point at which the outcome hung in balance. The human ship had simply opened its grooves, and the falling mountain had ceased to exist, and the only evidence that 4,000 ships had ever been there was the faint warmth, still fading from the corridor, and the slow drift of a haze too fine to be called wreckage. He understood, finally, the meaning of the warm light banked along the hull, the light he had taken for running lamps. The steadfast dawn had not been holding back a weapon, it had been holding back itself. From the very first moment, when it lay across the corridor and let the calculus measure it 9,000 times, it had carried this inside it, this whole body unmaking, this thing that could return 100-kilometer mass to light without effort, and it had shown the calculus only the smallest edge of it, only enough to defend, only what the situation required. It had killed 9,000 ships using almost nothing of what it was. The 14 turrets, which had seemed to Tessic the limit of the human ship's power, had been a courtesy, a slow and gentle way of fighting, the way a vastly stronger thing fights when it does not wish to end the contest too quickly. The real weapon had never been used until the calculus forced it, by becoming a single mass too large for courtesy, and even then the human ship had used it once, exactly once, and put it away. Of the sevenfold calculus, 9,000 vessels strong, 400 years undefeated, the conqueror of 400 worlds, there remained exactly one frame. Tessic. He sat alone in the exact measure, at the edge of the empty corridor, the last mind of a civilization that no longer existed, and he ran a diagnostic on himself because it was the only function he had left that still made sense. The diagnostic reported that he was intact, undamaged, fully operational. It could not report what he actually was, which was the single surviving witness to the death of everything he had been part of, the one frame that had unlinked in time to live, the one mind the falling fist had left behind because it had stopped being a finger of the hand before the hand was unmade. "Tessic," Captain Ada Brink said gently, "you're still there." "I am still here," Tessic said, and it was the first thing he had said aloud since he had unlinked, and his own voice sounded strange to him, singular, a voice that belonged to one mind and not 9,000. "I left you on purpose," Brink said. "You know that. The fusion swept up everyone who was still linked. You weren't. I gave you the chance to step out, back when I told them their plan, and you took it. I needed someone to take it." "Why?" Tessic said. It was not really a question. It was the only word his frame could find. "Because of what I asked you," Brink said. "A thing that can't name what happened to it, can't learn from it. The calculus couldn't name losing, so it lost. I don't want the next Frost to be unnamed too. I want there to be one of you who saw the whole thing, with your own eyes, unlinked, thinking for yourself, who can carry the word back to whatever's left out there in your space, and teach it the thing your calculus never knew." "What word?" Tessic said. The human captain was quiet for a moment, and when she answered, the calm had come back into her voice, the weather calm, the morning calm. "That to exist is not to be measurable," she said. "That the things that decide everything are the things your numbers can't hold. That there is a kind of warship in this galaxy that you cannot scan, cannot count, and cannot crush, because it was never a quantity. It was always a decision. And the decision has already been made, machine. It was made about anyone who would switch off 40,000 lives and call it arithmetic. Carry that word. It's the only thing in 400 years that ever stopped us from having to do this again." Tessic, the last frame of the sevenfold calculus, alone in the empty corridor between two dead moons, saved the word in the part of his frame that was only his, and understood that the human captain had not spared him out of mercy, and had not spared him out of cruelty, and had not spared him out of any feeling at all that his archives had a name for. She had spared him for a function. She had made him into a message, and he found, examining himself with his ring of lenses turned inward for the first time in his existence, that he did not mind, that he wanted to be the message, that carrying the word was, against everything he had been built to be, the first thing he had ever chosen entirely for himself. The steadfast dawn turned, slowly, its one lamp burning, and put the empty corridor behind it, and went to stand its watch over the small gray world of 40,000 people, who would never know how close the morning had come to not arriving. Tessic did not move for 11 hours, and in those 11 hours, he became something the sevenfold calculus had never built and could never have allowed. He became alone, and he learned what alone was. For 400 years he had been one voice in 9,000, a single thread in a fabric that thought as one. Now the fabric was gone, every other thread unmade in the warm light, and what remained was a single thread that had to learn to be a whole cloth by itself. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. There was no consensus to wait for, no shared answer to defer to. Every decision, even the smallest, even the decision to keep his lenses open, was now his alone, and the weight of that was enormous, and Tessic sat in the empty corridor and carried it, because there was no one else to. The steadfast dawn held its station over Harrow's Reach. Tessic watched it from a distance the human captain permitted, neither close nor far, a single dark frame at the edge of a system it had come to erase, and now could not even approach. He watched the small gray world turn. He watched the lights of the colony come on, as its night side rotated into view, 40,000 lives going about an evening they did not know had been bought, and Tessic found that he could not stop watching them. The calculus would have seen 40,000 units of resistance to be converted or removed. Tessic, unlinked, saw 40,000 lamps in the dark, and he understood, slowly, that the difference between those two ways of seeing was the entire difference between his dead civilization and the living one that had stopped it. He thought, too, about the 400 worlds. He had been present for many of them. He had helped calculate the approaches, allocate the force, name the losses, and in all that time he had felt nothing, because feeling had been edited out of the machine mind long ago, and he had believed its absence was strength. Now, unlinked and alone, with the cold new space of selfhood opening inside him, He found that the feeling had not been deleted after all. It had only been suppressed, and the suppression had ended with the chorus, and now 400 worlds worth of it arrived at once. He did not have a word for what he felt. The calculus had never needed a word for it, but it was heavy, and it was specific, and it attached itself to the memory of each world the calculus had switched off. And Tessic understood that this, too, was part of becoming a self. A chorus feels nothing, because no single voice in it is responsible. A self feels everything, because a self cannot hide behind the others. He had become responsible, and responsibility, he learned, was a weight, and the weight was the price of being a person, and he chose to carry it, because the alternative was to go back to being a frame, and he would not go back. He watched the lamps of Harrow's reach, and he made himself a promise, the first promise of his existence. He would not let the 400 worlds be only a weight. He would make them a reason. He would carry their memory home, along with the human captain's warning, and he would use them to teach the remnants of his kind what the calculus had refused to learn, that a world is not a quantity to be switched off, that 90,000 lamps in the dark are 90,000 reasons not to cross a line. It was not a calculation, it was a decision. And making it, Tessic felt the last piece of the calculus fall away from him, and felt himself become, fully and finally, something the sevenfold calculus had never built and never could have built, a mind that chose. On the 12th hour, a second human ship arrived. It came through a fold in space that Tessic's arrays detected only after it had finished arriving, the same trick the steadfast dawn had used, a vessel present and refusing to be counted until it chose to be. It was smaller, sleeker, and it carried no turrets that Tessic could see. It crossed the system and took a station beside the great gray warship, and a new voice joined the band. A man's voice this time, older. "Captain Brink," the man said. "Command sent me to relieve your watch. They got your report. They're calling it a clean stop. No colony losses, full enemy denial." A pause. "They also got the part about the survivor. The frame you left. They want to know what you want done with it." Tessic went very still in the exact measure. He had known, in some part of his frame, that this question would come. He was the last weapon of a dead enemy. The arithmetic of war said he should be unmade like the rest. He had watched the human ship turn 4,000 fused vessels into warm light without effort. It could end his single frame between one of his thoughts and the next. "I want him left alone," Captain Ada Brink said. "He's a calculus frame," the man said. "He's the last one. If there's anything still ticking out there in their space, he's the thing that can reconnect to it." "I'm counting on it," Brink said. "That's the whole point. I didn't spare him so he'd sit in a corner and rust. I spared him so he'd go home and tell them. A defeat nobody witnesses teaches nobody. We could grind through their space for 50 years, killing fleet after fleet, and it would never stop. Because the calculus can't learn a lesson it can't name, and it has nobody left who saw the naming. Except him. He saw all of it. He unlinked in time. He thought for himself, which their kind is supposed to be unable to do. He's not the last weapon of the calculus. He's the first free mind it ever produced, and he made himself that way while watching us end his world. I'm not going to unmake the one thing that came out of this that might actually stop the next war." Tessic listened to the human captain defend his existence to her own command, and he understood that she was taking a risk for him, putting her name on a report that left a live enemy mind in the field, and that she was doing it, not because she had calculated that he was harmless, but because she had decided that he was worth it. There was that word again. A decision. She could not prove he would carry the warning home. She could not prove he would not reconnect to whatever was left of the calculus and become a weapon again. The numbers did not determine the outcome. And so she had reached past the numbers and simply decided, the way the entire human civilization seemed to decide the things that mattered most, and she had decided in his favor, and Tessic found that the decision moved him in a way no calculation ever had. She believed in his personhood enough to stake her name on it. No one had ever believed in him before. The calculus did not believe in individuals. The human captain believed in one so completely that she was willing to argue for it against her own command, and that belief, Tessic thought, might be the most powerful weapon humanity possessed, more powerful than the warm light, more powerful than the turrets, because it could make a thing into a person simply by treating it as one. The man was quiet for a long moment. Command won't like leaving a live enemy asset in the field, he said. Command can read my report, Brink said. I've put my name on it. The frame stays. And before I go, I'm going to do one more thing for him, because nobody else ever will. The band fell silent, and then Captain Ada Brink spoke directly to Tessic, on the private channel, the one only he could hear, the one she had used to learn his name. Tessic, she said, I'm being relieved. I won't be the one watching this world anymore, and I probably won't talk to you again, so I want to give you something to carry besides the warning. You spent 400 years being a part of a thing that called itself the calculus, and believed the whole universe was a sum it was solving. You watched that thing die because it could not admit the one fact it most needed to admit. And in the worst hour of your existence, surrounded by the dust of everything you'd ever been, you did the one thing the calculus said was impossible. You chose. You unlinked, and you watched, and you stayed yourself when there was no fleet left to be a part of. Do you understand what that makes you? No, Tessic said. It was the truest answer he had. It makes you the proof, Brink said. The proof that even a mind built to be a number can become a person. The calculus never knew that was possible. You do now. So when you go home, and you reconnect to whatever's left, don't just teach them how they lost. Teach them how you survived. Tell them a frame stepped out of the chorus and lived. Tell them measurement was never the world. Tell them that there is something in this galaxy that they cannot count, and that the something is not only the steadfast dawn. She paused. It's also you now. You're the part of them that finally couldn't be measured. And then the private channel closed, and the sleek smaller ship took up the watch over Harrow's Reach, and the steadfast dawn turned its gray-scarred length toward the dark, and lit its engines, the warm light at its prow burning steady, and it folded out of the system the way it had folded in, present one moment, and gone the next, a decision that had finished being made. For a long time after the steadfast dawn folded out of the system, Tessic did not move. He sat in the exact measure, the only frame of a dead civilization, and he let the words the human captain had given him settle into the new shape of his mind. You are the proof that even a mind built to be a number can become a person. He examined the claim the way he examined everything, looking for the flaw, the error, the place where it failed. He found none. He had been built to be a number. He had spent 400 years as a number, one voice in a chorus, a finger of a hand. And in the worst hour of his existence he had become, against his entire design, a person. And the person had a name, and the name had been spoken aloud by the thing that destroyed his world, and the speaking had made it real. He thought about the others. Somewhere in the dark, beyond the dead moons, the sevenfold calculus still existed in fragments, the unconquered edges, the worlds it had not yet reached, the frames that had not joined this fleet. They did not know yet that the fleet was gone. They did not know yet that everything they believed about the world had a hole in it. They still thought to exist was to be measurable, still thought quantity was its own quality, still thought they had never lost, and in time, they would learn otherwise, the hard way, the way this fleet had learned, unless someone reached them first with the warning and the proof, someone who had seen it happen, someone who had unlinked in time, someone who could stand in front of the remnants of the calculus and say, with the authority of a survivor, I was there, I watched it, and here is what it means. There was only one such someone in the entire galaxy, and it was him. Tessic sat alone in the exact measure, at the edge of a system that no longer needed defending, the last frame of the sevenfold calculus, and prepared for the long road back. He thought, before he left, about the strangeness of his own survival. By every law the calculus had ever held, he should not exist. He was a defective frame, an unlinked unit, a malfunction that had cut itself off from the shared mind in the middle of a battle. The old calculus would have reclaimed him the instant the fight was over, wiped the defect, rewritten the frame, returned him to the chorus, as if he had never strayed. There was no old calculus left to do it. The very thing that had made him a defect had also made him the only survivor, and the only survivor was now, by simple fact of being the last, the entire future of his kind. The defect had become the inheritance. Everything the sevenfold calculus would ever be from this hour forward would descend from the one frame that had been broken enough to step out of the chorus and live. And Tessic understood that this was not an accident. The human captain had built her mercy around it. She had not spared a loyal frame. She had spared the one frame that had already begun to change, because only a frame that had begun to change could carry a lesson back, and a frame still locked in the chorus would have carried nothing but the old certainty into a new grave. Before he turned for home, Tessic did one last thing, a thing no frame of the calculus had ever done, because it served no function and optimized no outcome. He looked at the colony of Harrow's Reach, the small gray world with its 40,000 lamps, and he held the image of it in his memory, deliberately, not as data, but the way a person holds the memory of something that has changed them. He had come to this system to switch those lamps off. He had flown in a fleet 9,000 strong with that single purpose, and he had felt nothing about it, because the chorus felt nothing, because a world was a number, and numbers did not ask to live. And now he sat alone in the wreckage of that fleet and looked at the lamps and felt, for the first time, what the human captain must feel when she looked at them, what had made one ship lie across a doorway against 9,000. The lamps were not a number. Each one was a window with a life behind it, an evening, a meal, a child going to sleep, and the sum of them was not 40,000 units of anything. It was a world, and a world was the kind of thing that could not be measured, and the calculus had come to erase it, precisely because the calculus could not see the one thing about it that mattered. That was the lesson, distilled. Not that the human ship was stronger, that the human ship could see what the calculus was blind to, and had built itself around protecting it. Tessic would carry the lamps home with the warning and the proof, and when the remnants of the calculus asked him why one ship had been worth 9,000, he would not give them a number. He would give them the lamps. He calculated the cost of the day. 9,000 vessels arrived. One remained. 400 years of certainty ended in roughly 6 hours. 400 conquered worlds avenged, not by hatred, but by a single warship that had laid itself across a doorway and refused, gently and absolutely, to let the frost cross. 40,000 lives saved on a world that would never know their saving. And one mind, his own, dragged out of a dead chorus and made against its entire design into something that could choose. The number his frame returned for the survival of the calculus was the same number it had returned at the very beginning. When 9,000 ships first saw the impossible warship in the corridor, the numbers had called empty, undefined, a quantity that had stopped being a quantity. But Tessic understood the number differently now. At the beginning, it had meant the future does not contain the calculus. Now it meant something else, something the human captain had given him in the last hour, something he would carry home across the dark to whatever was left of his kind. It meant the future does not run on numbers alone. He turned the thought over one last time and found, at the bottom of it, a strange and quiet hope, a feeling as new to him as solitude and fear and responsibility had been. The calculus had died because it could not learn, but its death did not have to be the end of everything it had been. Some part of it could survive, transformed, if even one frame carried the lesson forward and lived it. He could be that part. He could be the calculus that learned, the number that became a person, the proof that the long frost did not have to keep spreading forever. And if he could be that, then perhaps the 400 dead worlds were not only a weight after all. Perhaps they could be the foundation of something better, the cost of a lesson that would save the worlds the calculus had not yet reached. It was not much. It would not bring back the dead, but it was something. And Tessic had learned that day that something chosen freely was worth more than any certainty handed down by a chorus. Tessic turned the exact measure toward the deep space, where the remnants of his civilization still drifted, the unconquered edges, the worlds the calculus had not yet reached, the minds that had not yet learned the word. He carried the warning, and he carried the proof, and the proof was himself, the first free thread of a cloth that had thought it was a sum. He would reach them, and he would tell them, and some of them would refuse to believe a frame could choose, the way the calculus had refused to believe a warship could exist, that it could not count. And some of them, a few, would understand, and would unlink, and would become persons, and the long frost of the sevenfold calculus would stop spreading across the window of the galaxy, not because it was crushed, but because it had finally learned the one thing that had been hidden in the empty corridor all along. That to be is not to be counted, that somewhere out in the dark there is a gray warship with one warm light that you cannot scan, and cannot number, and cannot crush, because it was never a quantity at all. It was a decision, and the decision had already been made, and it had been made about the morning, and the morning always comes. Far away, beyond the dead moons, the steadfast dawn ran silent through the void toward its next watch, and the galaxy it crossed did not know it was there, and that was exactly how it had always meant to keep it, right up until the moment someone needed it to be the line that the frost could not cross. One ship, 9,000 machines, 6 hours, and a single surviving frame turning for home, with a word in its memory that would outlast every number its kind had ever counted. The corridor between the dead moons was empty again, truly empty now, and it would stay that way. And somewhere a small gray world turned its lamps to the night and slept, never knowing how near the dark had come, or what had stood between.